I was restocking my freezer when I first heard the hum of electricity die. The lights flickered once, twice, and then everything went dark. I didn't think much of it. Initially, power outages in Cedar Grove weren't uncommon during summer thunderstorms. But when I looked outside my window, I noticed something odd. Every other house on my street still had power. Just mine was dark. My name is Sean Foster, and this is how my personal war with the Cedar Grove Homeowners Association began. I'd moved into Cedar Grove Estates 6 months earlier, drawn by the manicured lawns, quiet streets, and relative affordability compared to other Boston suburbs. The house was perfect, a modest colonial with enough backyard space for barbecues and the occasional game of catch with my nephew when he visited. What I hadn't counted on was the iron grip of the HOA, run with dictatorial precision by Patricia Walters. That first night without power, I called the utility company. After being on hold for 45 minutes, a bored customer service rep informed me that according to their records, my power had been deliberately disconnected at the request of the Cedar Grove HOA. "There must be some mistake," I said, pacing my darkening kitchen by cell phone flashlight. "They can't just cut off someone's power." "Sir, if the HOA has easement rights in your community bylaws, they absolutely can request disconnection. You'll need to contact them directly." I hung up and immediately tried the emergency HOA number. It went straight to voicemail. I left what I thought was a reasonably polite message considering the circumstances, then tried to salvage what I could. My freezer had been fully stocked just 2 days earlier. I'd taken advantage of a massive sale at Costco, buying enough premium steaks, organic chicken, wild-caught salmon, and other gourmet items to last months. I'm a food enthusiast, some might say obsessive, and I'd spent nearly $5,000 on high-end meats and seafood that were now beginning to warm. I drove to the gas station and bought all the ice they had, packing it around the most expensive items. But without power, I knew it was a losing battle. The next morning, I was standing on Patricia Walters' pristine porch at 7 a.m. sharp, unshaven and fuming. She answered the door in a peach-colored jogging outfit, her blonde bob perfectly styled despite the early hour. "Mr. Foster," she said, thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. "This is highly inappropriate. HOA business hours are 9 to 5, Monday through Thursday." "My power's been cut off," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "The utility company says you requested it." Patricia sighed dramatically. "Yes, and you know exactly why. The board voted unanimously after your repeated violations." "What violations? I haven't violated anything." She produced a tablet from seemingly nowhere and began scrolling. March 15th, unapproved mailbox color. April 2nd, garbage cans left visible from street view. May 7th, unauthorized garden gnome. And now, she looked up with the triumphant gleam of someone who'd caught a child stealing cookies. "The unregistered vehicle parked in your driveway for over 2 weeks. My brother's Jeep. He's deployed overseas. I told the board I'm watching it until he returns next month." Unregistered vehicles must be stored in garages or off property, as clearly stated in Section 37B of the Covenant. You were issued 3 warnings. So you cut my power. Do you realize I have thousands of dollars of food spoiling? This is insane. Patricia's face hardened. The board found this to be the most effective way to ensure compliance. Once you've moved the vehicle and paid the accumulated fines, which now total $750, your power will be restored. I was speechless. The sheer pettiness of it all, cutting someone's electricity over a perfectly functional vehicle parked in my own driveway, was breathtaking. "This is illegal," I finally managed. "I assure you, it's not. The covenant you signed gives the association broad powers to enforce compliance." "Perhaps next time you'll read the documents before signing." She started to close the door. "Oh, and the fines increase by $50 each day the vehicle remains." By the time I returned home, everything in my refrigerator was warm. The freezer contents were rapidly thawing, with puddles of pink meat juice collecting at the bottom. The steaks alone had cost nearly $1,200. I made desperate calls to friends, but no one had enough freezer space to store even half of my inventory. I moved my brother's Jeep to a storage facility that afternoon, paying $120 for a month's rental. Then I drove to the bank, withdrew $750 in cash, and marched into the HOA office where a board assistant accepted my payment without comment. "How soon will my power be restored?" I asked. "The board meets tomorrow to approve reconnection requests. If approved, the utility company usually reconnects within 48-72 hours. 3 more days, all my food will be ruined," the assistant shrugged. "You should have complied sooner." I spent that night in a hotel, calling every hour to check if power had been restored. By the following evening, when I returned home to assess the damage, the stench hit me before I even opened the door. The interior of the house was sweltering in the summer heat, and every bit of food in my freezer and refrigerator was beyond saving. I documented everything with my phone camera: the ruined food, the temperature readings, the puddles of putrid liquid. Then I loaded 13 garbage bags full of spoiled meat, seafood, and other perishables into my car and drove straight to Patricia Walters' house. This time, her husband Ted answered the door. He was a small man with thinning hair and nervous eyes that widened when he saw me standing there, unshaven and reeking of spoiled food. "Is Patricia home?" I asked with forced politeness. "She's at her book club until 9, he replied, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if she might materialize behind him. "Can I help with something?" "Yes, actually, I brought something to show her." I returned to my car and retrieved one of the garbage bags. Ted's face paled as I approached the porch again. "What is that smell?" he asked, taking an involuntary step back. This is $5,000 worth of ruined food from my freezer. Your wife cut my power over a parking violation." I opened the bag slightly, allowing the putrid odor to waft toward him. Ted gagged visibly. "Look, Sean, I understand you're upset, but Patricia just follows the rules. The board voted, save it. Just tell her I'll be filing a police report for criminal sabotage and vandalism, and she'll be hearing from my attorney. Every board member who voted on this will be personally named in the lawsuit." I left the bag on their perfectly manicured lawn, a rancid monument to HOA overreach. That night, after filing a police report that the officer seemed skeptical about but dutifully recorded, I researched my options. Massachusetts property law was complex regarding HOA powers, but one thing became clear: while associations could levy fines and place liens, the deliberate disconnection of utilities specifically to cause property damage was potentially criminal. The next morning, my power was miraculously restored. I received a curt email from the HOA office stating that my compliance had been noted and service was being reinstated as a gesture of good faith. Too little, too late. I had already contacted 3 attorneys, and the one I liked best, Priya Mehta, a fiery litigator with a personal vendetta against overzealous HOAs, agreed to take my case immediately. "This is textbook intimidation and a legal punishment," Priya said when we met at her downtown office. She wore a crisp charcoal suit that somehow didn't wilt in the summer heat, unlike my sweat-stained button-down. "They can fine you. They can even put a lien on your property for unpaid fines, but deliberately causing the destruction of personal property? That's criminal." The officer who took my report didn't seem convinced, I admitted. Police often don't understand the nuances of property law, but the DA might see it differently, especially with the documentation you've gathered. She tapped my phone containing the photos and videos. "This is excellent evidence. Most people don't think to document everything so thoroughly. I work in medical research. Documentation is second nature. It's going to serve you well here. Now we have 2 paths, civil and criminal. Civilly, we'll sue for the value of destroyed property, emotional distress, and punitive damages. Criminally, we'll push the DA to investigate for criminal mischief, vandalism, and potentially even extortion. I want them all held accountable, I said firmly. Especially Patricia Walters. Priya smiled, a predatory gleam in her eye. She's the one who signed the disconnection order, I presume. She basically admitted it to my face. Perfect. Let's get started. The following week was a blur of legal filings, evidence cataloging, and increasingly frantic messages from the HOA board. First came an offer to reimburse me $500 for any inconvenience caused. When that was ignored, they upped it to $1,000 and a one-year waiver of HOA fees. Patricia Walters herself called me directly the day after we filed our lawsuit. "This is completely unnecessary," she said, her voice lacking its usual imperious tone. "The board is willing to make reasonable accommodations for your losses. $5,000 in food, Patricia. Plus my hotel stays, laundry services to remove the stench from my clothes, and the rental fee for my brother's Jeep. We're talking close to $7,000 in direct costs alone. That's preposterous. No one has $5,000 of food in their freezer. I have receipts for everything, itemized." There was a long pause. The board could perhaps authorize $2,500 as a settlement with a confidentiality clause. Not interested. And you should know, I'm not just suing the HOA as an entity, I'm naming you and every board member who voted for this personally. Another pause, longer this time. "You can't do that. We're protected by the association's insurance. Not for intentional acts that violate state law. My attorney says your insurance will likely deny coverage, which means your personal assets are at risk. Your house, Patricia. Your retirement accounts. Everything." I heard what sounded like a glass being set down hard. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Foster. The community stands behind the board's decisions." "We'll see about that. I've been talking to neighbors. Turns out I'm not the first person you've done this to." I hung up feeling a grim satisfaction. The next day, we filed an amended complaint adding 3 more plaintiffs, all Cedar Grove residents, who had experienced similar utility disconnections for minor violations in the past year. None had lost as much as I had, but collectively, their stories painted a damning pattern of abuse. The local news picked up the story 2 days later. I hadn't contacted them, but Priya admitted she might have mentioned the case to a producer she knew. The headline blared across the screen. "HOA terror. Power cut, thousands in food lost over parking dispute." The reporter ambushed Patricia outside the community center, thrusting a microphone toward her as she tried to hurry to her car. "Mrs. Walters, do you think it's appropriate to disconnect a homeowner's electricity over a parking violation?" Patricia's face contorted in fury. "This is private property. You're trespassing. Multiple homeowners claim you personally ordered utility disconnections as punishment for minor covenant violations. How do you respond?" The board acts collectively to maintain community standards. Anyone who purchases in Cedar Grove agrees to abide by these standards. But cutting off power, potentially endangering residents if they rely on medical equipment, isn't that extreme? Patricia finally reached her car, slamming the door without further comment. But the damage was done. The 3-minute segment, complete with shots of my ruined food and interviews with the other affected homeowners, aired on the evening news and immediately went viral locally. By morning, my phone was buzzing constantly with messages from neighbors I'd barely spoken to before. They offered support, shared their own HOA horror stories, and in several cases asked to join our lawsuit. Patricia's reputation in the community, apparently built on fear rather than respect, began crumbling under scrutiny. The district attorney's office contacted Priya 2 days after the news story. An assistant DA wanted to review our evidence and take formal statements. Things were moving faster than either of us had anticipated. "This is unusual," Priya admitted when she called to tell me about the DA's interest. "Typically, these cases are seen as civil matters, not criminal, but the pattern of behavior combined with the media attention has them concerned. What exactly could they be charged with? I asked. Criminal mischief and vandalism at minimum. Potentially criminal sabotage of utility services, which carries stiffer penalties. And if we can prove the board knew people might have medical equipment depending on electricity, which is likely in a community with many retirees, there could be reckless endangerment charges. Could they actually go to jail? For first-time offenders with no priors, probably not. But significant fines, probation, community service, and a permanent criminal record are definitely on the table. And that's separate from our civil case, which keeps getting stronger. Indeed, our civil complaint had grown to include 7 plaintiffs, all with similar stories of utility disconnections for trivial violations. The local paper ran a feature story titled Power Trip, the HOA that rules by darkness, complete with an unflattering photo of Patricia scowling at the camera. The Cedar Grove HOA board called an emergency meeting the following Monday evening. The community center was packed. I'd never seen so many of my neighbors in one place. Patricia sat at the center of the board table, flanked by 6 other members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "This meeting will come to order," Patricia announced, pounding a gavel with unnecessary force. "The board has called this session to address recent concerns about enforcement procedures." A chorus of angry murmurs swept through the room. "Concerns? You're being sued." "And investigated by the DA," someone shouted from the back. Patricia's face tightened. "As I was saying, the board is reviewing its enforcement protocols to ensure they align with community values." "How about basic human decency?" called another voice. I sat quietly near the front, Priya beside me taking notes. We'd agreed I wouldn't speak unless directly addressed, letting the community's anger speak for itself. Ted Walters, sitting awkwardly at his wife's side as the board treasurer, leaned toward the microphone. "Perhaps we should begin by acknowledging that mistakes may have been made in some enforcement actions." Patricia shot him a withering glare, but Ted continued, his voice gaining strength. "The disconnection of utilities was never explicitly approved as a standard enforcement mechanism in our charter. It began as a one-time measure 3 years ago and evolved." "Ted," Patricia hissed, but he ignored her. "I move that we immediately cease any utility disconnections as enforcement actions and restore service to any affected homes." Ted looked around the room, avoiding his wife's gaze. "And that we offer reasonable compensation for any damages caused." One of the other board members, an elderly man named Harold, quickly seconded the motion. Patricia looked stunned, as if she'd never considered the possibility of board rebellion. "This is not the appropriate forum for policy changes," she said stiffly. "The board needs to discuss this in executive session." "I call for an immediate vote," Harold insisted, his voice cracking with emotion. "My own sister had her water shut off last year over a dispute about holiday decorations. She's 78 years old. I didn't know the board was doing this until this lawsuit came out." Patricia looked around for support but found none. Even the board members who had been her staunchest allies were avoiding eye contact. The room had turned against her. "Fine, we'll vote." Her voice was ice. "All in favor of immediately ceasing utility disconnections as an enforcement mechanism and offering compensation to affected parties." Every board member except Patricia raised their hand. The room erupted in applause. "Motion carries," she said through gritted teeth. "Now, if there's no further business, actually," I stood up, ignoring Priya's cautioning hand on my arm, "there is one more item. The homeowners would like to call for a special election to replace the current board president." Patricia's face went from pale to crimson. "There is no provision for mid-term removal in our bylaws." "Actually, there is," called a voice from the back. It belonged to Douglas Chang, a retired attorney who had lived in Cedar Grove since it was built. Article 7, Section 4 allows for removal of officers by 2/3 vote of homeowners present at a special meeting, provided quorum is met. He held up a well-thumbed copy of the community bylaws. We have more than quorum present tonight. Patricia looked like she might explode. This is an ambush. Kind of like having someone's power cut off without warning, I suggested mildly. The vote that followed wasn't even close. Patricia was removed as president by a margin of 87-3, with the only supporting votes coming from her, Ted, who looked like he was voting under duress, and her best friend from the garden committee. As the meeting adjourned, Patricia stormed out, pausing only to jab a finger in my direction. This isn't over, Foster. Not by a long shot. But for all practical purposes, it was. The next day, the HOA's insurance company notified the board that they were declining coverage for the lawsuit, citing the intentional and potentially criminal nature of the actions. The board members would be personally liable for any damages, a fact that quickly led to settlement discussions. Within a week, we had an offer. Full reimbursement for all documented losses plus an additional 50% for distress and inconvenience. For me, that meant over $10,000. The other plaintiffs would receive similar proportional settlements. Additionally, the HOA would amend its covenant to explicitly prohibit utility disconnections for any reason other than necessary repairs, and would require formal training for all board members on legal limits of enforcement. Priya advised accepting the settlement for the civil case. "It's a good offer," she said. "More importantly, it achieves the systemic changes you wanted." "What about the criminal investigation?" I asked. "That's separate and continues regardless of our settlement." "The DA will make their own determination about charges." 2 days after we accepted the settlement, I received a hand-delivered envelope. Inside was a personal check from Patricia Walters for $5,000 and a handwritten note. "I hope this additional compensation helps address your losses." I sincerely apologize for my actions. The apology seemed forced, likely advised by her personal attorney, but the check was real. I considered returning it out of principle, but instead, I endorsed it over to the local food bank. Somehow, it seemed fitting. 3 weeks later, the district attorney announced charges against Patricia Walters and 2 former board members who had been most involved in the utility disconnection policy. Patricia faced the most serious charges: 7 counts of criminal mischief, 3 counts of criminal sabotage of utility services, and 1 count of reckless endangerment related to an elderly resident whose oxygen concentrator had been compromised during a power disconnection. The media had a field day. HOA president faces felony charges in utility cutoff scandal dominated local headlines. Patricia and her co-defendants appeared for arraignment looking shell-shocked, as if they still couldn't quite believe their HOA activities had resulted in criminal charges. I attended the arraignment with several other affected homeowners. Patricia avoided looking at any of us as the charges were read. She pleaded not guilty to all counts, but her body language suggested she knew she was in serious trouble. Outside the courthouse, reporters thrust microphones toward me. "Mr. Foster, how do you feel about the charges?" "This was never about revenge," I said carefully. "It was about accountability. HOA boards provide valuable services to communities, but they're not above the law. They can't use their power to deliberately harm residents, which is exactly what happened here." "Do you think jail time is appropriate?" I considered the question. "That's for the courts to decide. I just want to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As the criminal case proceeded through preliminary hearings, life in Cedar Grove gradually returned to normal. The new HOA board, led by Douglas Chang, adopted a more collaborative approach to covenant enforcement. Violation notices became educational rather than punitive, and a new mediation process was established for disputes. My brother returned from deployment and reclaimed his Jeep, confused by its newfound fame in the neighborhood. "You turned my old Wrangler into a symbol of resistance." He laughed when I explained everything. Not intentionally, I admitted, but it did the job. Patricia and Ted Walters put their house on the market. Neighborhood gossip suggested they were divorcing. Ted had apparently found his spine during the ordeal and was finally standing up to his domineering wife. They received an offer within days, despite having to disclose the pending criminal charges to potential buyers. The day before they were scheduled to move, Patricia appeared on my doorstep. She looked different. Her perfectly coiffed hair was simpler, her designer outfit replaced by jeans and a plain blouse. The imperious posture was gone. "I wanted to speak with you before we leave," she said quietly when I answered the door. I hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. "Would you like some coffee?" She seemed surprised by the offer. "Yes, thank you." We sat at my kitchen table, an awkward silence stretching between us. Finally, she spoke. I wanted to apologize properly, not the lawyer-scripted version I sent before, but a real apology. She stared into her coffee. "I was wrong, completely wrong." "Yes, you were," I agreed, not making it easier for her. "The thing is, I never saw it that way. I thought I was protecting property values, maintaining standards. The rules seemed so important. Rules are important, so is basic humanity." She nodded slowly. "The criminal case. My attorney says I'll likely get probation and community service if I plead guilty. No jail time for a first offense. That seems reasonable. I'm going to take the plea. Ted and I are moving to Florida to start over." She finally met my eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I understand now how wrong I was." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but found none, just exhaustion and regret. "I appreciate you coming by," I said finally. "I hope you find a better balance in your new community." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I can promise you one thing: I'll never join another HOA board as long as I live." After she left, I sat for a long time thinking about power, community, and the thin line between order and tyranny. The entire ordeal had cost me a freezer full of gourmet food, but had given me something more valuable: a neighborhood that now functioned as a true community rather than a collection of rules and violations. 6 months later, I received notice that Patricia had officially pleaded guilty to reduce charges of criminal mischief and reckless endangerment. She received 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a $10,000 fine, most of which would go to a fund to assist low-income homeowners with utility emergencies. The Cedar Grove HOA, under Douglas's leadership, became a model for the region. Our story even inspired state legislation requiring HOAs to follow due process in enforcement actions, and explicitly prohibiting utility disconnections as punishment for covenant violations. As for me, I eventually agreed to serve on the Architectural Review Committee, something I never would have imagined before. My first official act was to approve a garden gnome variance that would have given Patricia Walters an aneurysm. Sometimes in the evening, I sit on my porch and watch my neighbors stroll by with their dogs, children playing in front yards without fear of violation notices, and elderly residents chatting on benches installed by the new HOA board. The community feels lighter somehow, as if a shadow has lifted. My freezer is full again, though I'm more careful about buying in bulk these days. My brother's deployment Jeep has been replaced by his new civilian vehicle, properly registered and parked in my driveway without incident. And the infamous garden gnome, the one that had been on Patricia's violation list, stands proudly by my front steps, a tiny monument to the limits of power. Last week, I received a postcard from Naples, Florida. The handwriting was unmistakable, Patricia's elegant script. It contained just 3 sentences. "Community board elections happening next week. Tempted to run just to show what I've learned about compassionate governance. Don't worry, Ted talked me out of it." I couldn't help but laugh. Some leopards do change their spots, it seems. Or at least, they learn to use them more wisely. The following spring, almost exactly 1 year after the power disconnection incident, the Cedar Grove community held a block party in the park at the center of our development. Douglas Chang presented me with a tongue-in-cheek award, a golden garden gnome mounted on a plaque reading "Defender of Homeowner Rights." "I don't know if I deserve this," I said when he called me up to accept it. "I was just trying to get my power back on and save my stakes." "Sometimes the best revolutions start with the smallest grievances," Douglas replied. "You reminded us all that communities are about people, not property values." As I looked around at my neighbors, many of whom I now counted as friends, I realized he was right. Cedar Grove had transformed from a collection of houses ruled by fear into a genuine neighborhood bound by mutual respect. That evening, as the party wound down, I helped stack chairs while chatting with Melissa Kim, the young mother who had moved in next door after the Walters left. "I heard all about the HOA drama before we bought," she admitted. "My husband was worried, but our realtor assured us things had changed." "Completely different now," I confirmed. "Douglas runs a tight ship, but a fair one, I noticed." She grinned. "They approved our basketball hoop in less than 24 hours. My brother lives in a community where they've been fighting for one for 3 years. Small victories, perhaps, but meaningful ones." As we finished cleaning up, Douglas approached with a thick envelope. "The final settlement checks from the insurance company," he explained, handing it to me. "The last chapter in the saga." I accepted it with mixed feelings. The money was welcome, but it had never been my primary motivation. "Hard to believe it's really over." "Not over," Douglas corrected. "Just transformed into something better." Later that night, I sat on my porch watching fireflies blink in the summer darkness, the golden gnome award gleaming absurdly on my side table. My phone buzzed with a text from Priya, who had gone on to file similar cases against HOAs throughout the state. "Thought you'd want to know," her message read. "The Foster Act passed the state legislature today. No more power cutoffs by HOAs in Massachusetts. Your freezer disaster changed the law." I smiled and raised my glass in a silent toast to $5,000 worth of spoiled steaks and the unexpected revolution they had sparked. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about principle, it's about protecting your community from those who forget that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. In Cedar Grove, we'd learned that lesson the hard way. But some lessons, once learned, are never forgotten.